Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Baseball Beat. I'm Dan Lovallo. Our guest on this edition of the Baseball Beat is Chuck Kaiton. Chuck Kaiton is known for hockey, one of the outstanding play-by-play hockey broadcasters, formerly with the Hartford Whalers and the Carolina Hurricanes. So what is a hockey broadcaster doing on the Baseball Beat? Well, you'll have to listen to the podcast. So what are we doing on the Baseball Beat with one of the all-time great hockey broadcasters, Chuck Kaiton? But, Chuck, you're no stranger to baseball, right?
No, not really. I grew up, Dan, in Detroit, and obviously in your profession, you very well know the name Ernie Harwell, and I grew up listening to him do Tiger games, and I actually did some college baseball myself at the University of Michigan for a couple of years. I love the game, and so as a hockey, and I actually played high school baseball and had 3 kids that did in Connecticut as well, and a couple of them that played Legion ball in Simsbury, Connecticut. So baseball has been well, I can't use the trite thing, very, very good to me, but it's been certainly something I've loved for a long time.
You know, Chuck, I remember this is a few years back when I was working for another Hartford radio station, and Gordie Howe died, and you were kind enough within hours of the announcement that he had passed away to be a guest on my program. Talk a bit about your relationship with Gordie Howe.
Well, it was a very close one, and it still is very much so with his 3 sons, Mark, Marty, and Murray. And it almost brings a tear, Dan, to my eye when you mention him, because he was my idol as a kid growing up in Detroit. I loved watching him play in his earlier days. Actually, it was probably his latter days, because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and he, of course, came up in 1947. He was very close. That was one of the dreams come true when I came to the Hartford Whalers, really, Dan, was one of the first people I met was Gordie Howe. Who had played his last season in my first season of broadcasting in the NHL. We became very close. He did a between period feature on the radio for us, and became very close. And one of the biggest things for me was my mom and dad, of course, lived in Detroit, and every summer I would visit Gordie, because Gordie spent his summers later in years in a Detroit suburb. He actually lived in Mark Howe's house, one of his sons. And then when he passed away, I know we always had, my wife would make him an apple pie every time we'd go visit. We'd have lunch. So he became and that was just a dream come true for me. I mean, he was a superhuman being, as well as being, in my mind, the greatest player to ever play in the NHL.
The greatest player.
Oh, absolutely. I know. I'm obviously, I'm biased, because some people would say Gretzky. Some people, kids today, would say Connor McDavid or Sidney Crosby or Alexander Ovechkin. But easily for me, and some, of course, in my generation would also say Bobby Orr. But to me, it was Mr. Well, he's not Mr. Hockey for nothing. The late Gordie Howe.
How did you land the Whalers job? Where were you before the Whalers?
I did 4 years of a part of 9 in Big Ten athletics, the last 4 of which was in Madison, Wisconsin with the Badgers. And it's a funny story, summer of 78, after doing NCAA, the Wisconsin Badgers had a tremendous college hockey program under the late Bob Johnson. And in 78, the Badgers went to the NCAA finals in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was sitting there doing the game against Boston University. The Badgers lost that game. I came back home, and that summer I got a phone call from a couple of representatives of the then New England Whalers. They were still in the World Hockey Association and would be for that next year, and they asked me if I'd like to come out and interview for the job, and I told them no. Quite frankly, I have 2 young boys, 2 of the 3 that we eventually had. And I said, I've got a great job with the Badgers. I'm doing football, basketball, hockey. I'm doing a talk show. And I'm quite happy. And I had a little bit of what I thought was good inside information that the World Hockey Association was going to fold the next year, which it actually did. And there was no assurances that the New England Whalers would become the Hartford Whalers in the NHL and would be absorbed along with Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Quebec. So I said, no, I'm not interested. And they said, well, we're going to come into the NHL someday. And then they couldn't convince me. And so I stayed in Madison. And then when I picked up the paper in early June of 79, and I saw that, yes, the WHA is folding. It was a 6-team league that last year. And the only teams that didn't make it to the NHL were Cincinnati and Birmingham. But the other 4, sure enough, made it into the NHL, and I turned to my wife and I said, well, I guess I blew that opportunity. And they called me, and then again the phone rang in late August of that year. And I guess the backstory was Bob Newmeyer, who was the WHA broadcaster of the Whalers, ended up leaving to go to Channel 3. He wanted to do television, so he worked at a local television station here, WFSB, and that opened up the job. And the first question I asked when I got called again to come out to interview was, yes, I will take the job. And what happened to Bob Newmeyer? I thought, what happened to, or who was the broadcaster you hired last year? Did he get a one-year deal? And now I'm thinking, are they going to go through broadcasters like, sliced bread? And the late Bill Barnes, the marketing director of the team, who was way ahead of his time with respect to promotions and everything. I mean, the Whalers were the first team to have a gift store. And it started a trend that all sports have, just like you do here at the Yard Goats. He said, well, there were some problems with some of the players, and Howard Baldwin was going to fire him, but we ended up keeping him because he was so popular. And I was happy to hear that. And then I heard the story about him going to Channel 3, and that made me feel a lot better because I figured if Bob Newmeyer wasn't going to get fired, or if there was some announcer that wasn't lasting 1 year and getting fired, then I would have a pretty good track record. But the thing for me with what Bill said that sold me was that because he had a tape of mine that he asked me to submit so Jack Kelly, the general manager, could hear it, and some other people, although I had, the inside track on the job. He turned the tape on. He says, you're going to be better than Bob Newmeyer someday, with the fans. So, but as popular as he was. And I felt good about that because I felt that loyalty that there must have been with the fan base here, which is manifested by what the Yard Goats do.
No question about that. Now, you're with the Whalers. They almost make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. What do you remember about that playoff?
Well, of course, you're talking, Dan, of 1986 when they beat Quebec in the first round, which was a best-of-5 series, and they beat the Nordiques 3 straight. And then they went on to play Montreal, and it was a wonderful 7-game series. It really could have gone the Whalers' way. They were down 3. There's a couple of memories that I come up with. One was Kevin Dineen scoring an overtime goal in Game 6 in Hartford to send it to a Game 7. As he beat Patrick Waugh, he kind of cut around Larry Robinson, and you're doing something when you're cutting around a Hall of Fame defenseman like Robinson to score a goal top shelf under the crossbar on Patrick Waugh, who that year was a rookie in the NHL. And then they go to Game 7, and Dave Babich, who is part of Whalers Weekend here, gets a drop pass from Dean Evison. The Whalers are down 2-1 with 2 minutes to go in the third period. They tie it up, send Game 7 into overtime. Now, you've got to remember, you're in the hallowed Montreal Forum, and people are aghast. They're thinking, how can the Hartford Whalers be even in the same ballpark as the revered Montreal Canadiens? Well, put a pretty good scare into them. And then the other memory I had was of Ray Ferraro and John Anderson intercepting a bad pass coming in from the blue line. Anderson had the puck, drew Patrick Waugh to him. Ray Ferraro's breaking to the net, and Ray Ferraro's thinking that Anderson's going to shoot the puck and he's going to go for the rebound. Instead, Anderson threw the pass across thinking Ferraro was there for an open net tap-in, and Ray, of course, was behind Anderson waiting for a rebound. Puck went into the corner. Otherwise, the Whalers would have gone on and probably won the Stanley Cup, but they ended up not scoring on that play, and a few minutes later, it was Claude Lemieux who scored on Mike Liut in overtime, and Canadians won Game 7. But I think what you're referring to is that the next round they would have played the New York Rangers and probably would have beaten them because the Whalers had great chemistry that year. And then, obviously, they would have taken on the Calgary Flames. And that would have been a real interesting thing because Calgary was coached by Bob Johnson, the same Bob Johnson that I worked with as the coach of the Badgers in Wisconsin some years earlier. And it would have been nice to see Calgary versus Hartford because Calgary did get to the finals that year in the Western Conference. And, of course, the Whalers could have. And that was a tremendous memory for me.
If the Whalers win the Stanley Cup, does history change and the franchise remain in Hartford? What do you think?
Boy, I'll tell you what, I would love to say yes, and I think that it would have gotten a tremendous jump start, but I think, Dan, a couple of things would have had to happen, and these were unforeseen issues in 1986, one of which was the rise and the power of the Players Association in the NHL, which manifested itself 6 years later in 1992 when they struck with 2 weeks left in the season. And that was unheard of under Alan Eagleson, who was the former player representative. who a lot of people felt was in the owner's back pocket. Well, it wasn't true when Bob Goodenow took over a couple of years later and became the new executive director of the Players Association. So in '92, he got the players to strike. He got them to have salary disclosures. So now you had a situation where players knew what each other was making because they really didn't before. They had to ask each other, and sometimes they didn't get the right information. So the players got more power, and with more power came higher salaries. So I'm not sure a market like Hartford would have survived because of those factors. Certainly not from a fan support situation, but certainly from a fiscal situation. And that's why I'm saying I'm not sure. Because it's not just about winning on the ice, as we know in Raleigh the same way, because they won the Stanley Cup in '06, and the team is still losing tons of money because the economics have just exploded, Dan. And markets like Raleigh and Hartford probably would struggle quite a bit. So they would have needed a new arena. That was the other point I was going to make. I think they would have needed a new arena, something that Peter Karmanos wanted when he took over the team in 1994 and, of course, never got.
You moved with the franchise to Carolina, the South. Did you feel you had to introduce hockey to North Carolina?
Absolutely. And I still felt the same way when I did my first broadcast with Hartford Whalers because I knew fans, we were trying to recruit new people. And with the new league from WHA to NHL, I still felt like I had to introduce myself and my style to people and how I would educate new fans because it was all about growing the game. I mean, you couldn't just take for granted that just because we were between New York and Boston, that everybody was going to be a hockey fan, even in this area, because you would want to recruit new fans to the game that never had that exposure. But certainly in Raleigh, we had to do the same thing. And I would, again, I tap back into my youth and Ernie Harwell's philosophy in baseball that you can't talk down to the people that don't know the game, and you can't talk up to the people that do know the game, and you got to have that happy medium of explaining. So I would do it something like this. If there was an icing, I would explain again. Whenever the puck goes over center ice and then it goes across the goal line, blah, 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 offside, and some of the penalties. But I wouldn't beat fans that knew the game over the head with it. I would try to do it in a subtle way. And I think that was part of the education process, along with a lot of speaking engagements that we did that first few years in Raleigh, where people could ask all kinds of questions. And we had also an entity called Hurricane University, where we had people come in and they could be educated by professors or mock professors like myself that could explain the game to them.
What was it like calling a Stanley Cup winner in '06?
It was surrealistic. And believe it or not, the first people I thought of were the people in Hartford. Because, and I still get a lot of feedback on that because I guess with this YouTube generation and the fact that everything is recorded today, there's somewhere on the internet, there's my call of Justin Williams scoring to make it 3-1. He put an empty netter in against Edmonton that day in '06, and I remember saying that it was 9,339 days of NHL existence because I wanted to honor people in Hartford for those 18 years of NHL play. So I actually went back and counted the number of days that the Whalers and Hurricanes were in the NHL, and again, I said something like those days of 9,300 and some games have now led to a Stanley Cup. And again, it was a surrealistic situation, and I did think of all my friends here because, again, with technology, you had the internet, and anybody who wasn't alienated by the move of the team to Raleigh and still were true Whaler/Hurricane fans and who were happy for the team to win the Cup because, after all, Ron Francis was on the staff. He wasn't a player, but he was still there. And, in fact, he was the captain of the team in '02 when they went to the finals against Detroit. I know that there were a lot of people still here that could relate to it and were happy that the franchise did win the Cup.
A couple of more questions. First of all, are we going to hear you broadcasting hockey again?
I think so, and I'm hoping so. It would have to take a special situation to do it. And at my age, I don't know. I hope there's no age discrimination when it comes to enthusiasm for the game, but I certainly would love to again. And I think that targets to one specific team, because I'm not into just getting a job somewhere and moving to another existing NHL city. I was very intrigued by the Las Vegas situation and entertained going there a couple of years ago, even though I was still working for the Hurricanes. But now it's a little bit different situation that I'm not on the air now at this time. I've had some feelers and thoughts with the new expansion team, and it would be nice to start again, like 41 or 42 years past the fact, to start with a new franchise fresh again, because I think I could contribute something to that area. But we'll see what happens, because nothing's ever etched in stone. But it would be nice to work for the Seattle whatever they're called, and we'll see what happens.
I've always thought for the four major sports, baseball, football, basketball, hockey is the toughest sport to call, particularly on radio. How did you cut your teeth? I mean, there's a certain cadence you have to have as a broadcaster.
Well, I think I was real lucky, Dan, because I played the game as a kid in Detroit, and I watched a lot of hockey as a youngster. And my idols outside of Gordie Howe were broadcasters that did hockey in those days, from Foster Hewitt to Danny Gallivan in Montreal to Dan Kelly in St. Louis. And I would listen to them, and then I would, when I'd watch games on television or go to games at Olympia, I was kind of visualizing the game, having played it and broadcast it to myself or into a tape recorder when I was a teenager. It just came natural to me. I just loved the game. And it's all about anticipation. It's the same as playing the game. I played baseball, so you got to lean one way or another when you see a right-handed hitter or a left-handed hitter by the pitch. It was the same thing in broadcasting the game. I visualized things and saw things, and I would always try to envision how I would describe something that happened, like imaging it, And that's probably how I got to that point. As far as the name recognition, as far as the speed of the game, I think I was actually kind of born to do it because I loved the game, and that didn't intimidate me. But I do know that you're right. Now, see, I think baseball's a harder game to do.
Why?
Because you have to fill in the blanks and be entertaining. And I think that you guys do it well. I think a great baseball broadcaster has to have a lot more talent, in my opinion, to hold the audience than a hockey broadcaster does, because hockey's innately exciting. You've got to be able to make something sound exciting at the drop of a hat, because nothing happens and then everything happens once the ball's hit.
Well, it's both interesting, whether you're talking baseball or hockey. Chuck, I can't thank you enough for being a guest on the podcast, and we hope to hear you real soon.
Well, we'll see what happens. You never say never, but I'm kind of enjoying this not retiring. The biggest thing, Dan, and I know you would say the same thing, is it's about relationships. If you stop doing what you like doing, or you're forced to stop doing it, in my case, it's all about the people, and that's what I miss. And I would like to get back into it from that standpoint, because that's what it's all about. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you on the podcast. It's my pleasure.
You're welcome, Chuck Kaiton, our guest on the Baseball Beat. And as always, thanks for listening to the Baseball Beat. We are in all of the podcast directories, including the Apple Podcast Directory. And you can visit my website, thebaseballbeat.com. My next Baseball Beat coming up real soon, so be sure to follow me on this YouTube channel.